Hello friends, my name is JJ. So I was thinking a bit about what angle I wanted to take in talking about Justin Trudeau's recent announcement that he plans to resign as Prime Minister of Canada sometime this spring. And I ultimately concluded that it might be best to analyze it as a case study in the bizarre and often deeply undemocratic ways that the Canadian political system works, and how bad that system is at providing sane and stable leadership to Canada in a time of crisis. Specifically, the system gives way too much power to the Prime Minister and the heads of the political parties, and as a result, Canada's government often allows incredibly selfish, partisan interests to override the larger national interest of the country itself. Because, let's be very clear, Prime Minister Trudeau is only resigning for partisan reasons, and the fact that some new, unelected Prime Minister will soon be appointed to replace him is only happening for partisan reasons too. This new person will in turn be widely expected to lose the general election that Canada is legally required to have this year, although we don't know for sure when exactly that election will be, again, for partisan reasons. In any case, the ultimate outcome will be that Canada will very likely have 3 different prime ministers this year, and an election that will be held at some cynical and strategically timed moment. And none of these weird things will happen because they're good for the country or because the people of Canada want them to happen like this, but rather because the Canadian political system is designed in a way that routinely allows and even encourages deeply dumb and destructive scenarios like these to play out. And that is what we will be talking about today. But before we go any further, let us just hear a quick word from today's video sponsor, Ground News. Hello friends, so as the world gears up for a second Trump presidency, one of the only things we really know for certain is that everything is going to get a lot more polarized. Your perception of whether Trump and other populist leaders around the world are sane or scary, incompetent or successful, wicked or moral, will be very heavily framed by the kind of media that you consume. And that is why I have long relied on Ground News to help me navigate this omnipresent phenomena of polarized partisan media bias. Ground News is a revolutionary app and website that not only helps you aggregate links and headlines from all of the leading media outlets from around the world, but also sorts them based on the known bias of their reporting and commentary. This makes it very easy to see at a glance how 2 very different media outlets might choose to report the same facts. For example, take this story on Trump sharing a meme about annexing Canada. It was covered by 191 different sources, 17 of which had a left-leaning bias and 36 of which had a right-leaning one. For example, social media users slam Donald Trump's unhinged Canada maps, says HuffPost, versus over at Fox News, where we got Trump trolls Canada again, shares map with country as part of US. Oh, Canada. I have been using Ground News for many years now, and my favorite feature of theirs is something called Blind Spot, which I have installed as a widget on my iPhone. And throughout the day, the feed refreshes with different stories, one of which is being mostly covered by conservative media, and one of which is being mostly covered by liberal media. Ground News is now deeply integrated into the way that I keep on top of current affairs, and the same can be true of you. If you sign up using ground.news/JJ, or click on the link in the thing below, or use this handy-dandy QR code, you can get an amazing 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. It is an amazing deal at only about $5 a month. So what are you waiting for? Do not delay. Give Ground News a try today. Ground News. See every side of every story. Now, as I said, Prime Minister Trudeau is not resigning in response to some big scandal or some terrible mistake he's made recently. No, his resignation is a purely political decision born from the fact that his poll numbers have hit rock bottom and his path to winning a 4th term was looking increasingly impossible. Other politicians in Trudeau's Liberal Party had been turning aggressively against him in recent weeks, with a growing number of Liberal parliamentarians declaring that he should end his bid for a fourth term and step down for the good of the party. And by the first week of January 2025, it was clear that Trudeau's leadership of the Liberals had become too controversial to be sustainable, and thus he made his big declaration on the morning of January the 6th.
I intend to resign as party leader, as Prime Minister, after the party selects its next leader through a robust, nationwide, competitive process.
So, there are a few big conclusions that we can draw about some of the problems with the Canadian political system right off the bat. One is that there are no term limits. In theory, a Canadian Prime Minister can keep running for re-election forever, and this fact tends to seduce a lot of Canadian Prime Ministers with dreams of indefinite power. In the last 30 years, Canada has now seen 3 Prime Ministers win a third term, who then immediately begin making plans for a fourth. This would have made any of them Canada's longest continuously serving Prime Minister in over 100 years, which was obviously a pretty audacious goal, and yet they all chose to go for it. The Canadian public, however, doesn't want Prime Ministers that hang around for this long, and as a result, all of these guys saw their approval numbers tank midway through their third term, thereby making their fourth term dreams look increasingly far-fetched, if not pathetic. 2 of them wound up resigning before their fourth election, while the other one just ran for a fourth term anyway, and predictably got crushed by Justin Trudeau himself, incidentally. It's annoying that Canadians have to keep going through this same political soap opera over and over, because it always plays out the same way. The Prime Minister wins a third term and basks in his success, and there is initially some ambiguity as to whether or not he plans on running a fourth time, and then eventually they say yes, and no one really questions it at first because, it seems a long way off. But then, as the Prime Minister's years in power begin to drag on, the public grows increasingly sick of them, and their poll numbers begin to decline, and then their political party starts to get nervous about the next election, and pretty soon there is all this gossip in the press about how senior figures in the party are starting to question the Prime Minister's leadership, and Cabinet Minister so-and-so thinks that they should be Prime Minister instead, and all of this sort of thing. And then this segues into a campaign of low-key bullying the Prime Minister into resigning, which the press eagerly eggs on. Now, in fairness to the Prime Ministers, there is really no elegant solution to this. It is almost impossible to make a dignified exit in a regime with no term limits. If you announce that you have no intention of seeking another term, people will immediately start gossiping that, oh, he didn't feel confident that he could win again. He didn't want to face a humiliating defeat. What a coward. What a quitter. But on the other hand, if you brave the odds and just run for another term anyway, you will get blasted as an arrogant egomaniac whose vanity is steering his party to a humiliating defeat. What a loser. And thus we see the quitter-loser complex that always taints the final years of every Canadian Prime Ministership, and inevitably inflicts a long period of paralysis upon the Canadian government in which nothing productive gets done because the only thing anybody is talking about is the Prime Minister's future, which was basically the story of Canadian politics in 2024, where the only political debate anybody was having was about Trudeau's hold on power, as opposed to any substantial issue or policy. Now, as I alluded to, the way that unpopular Canadian Prime Ministers of this sort often wind up leaving office is by getting bullied into resigning. Politicians from the Prime Minister's party start complaining that they don't have faith in him anymore, first in private and then to the press. And then eventually this chorus of complaining gets so loud and distracting and embarrassing that the PM quits in a fit of shame. This end of regime tradition, incidentally, is basically the only time in Canada that members of a Prime Minister's party ever criticize him publicly. 99% of the time, Canadian politicians are obsessively loyal to their party leader, which is why the moment that any criticisms start to be expressed in public, it is generally treated as a very dramatic moment signaling that a point of no return has been passed. Another reason why this sort of bullying and shaming tends to be so popular is because in the Canadian system, there is not really any well-established alternative process for allowing a Canadian political party to ditch its boss, especially when that boss is currently serving as Prime Minister of the country. Generally speaking, once you are appointed head of a Canadian political party, you are locked in pretty tight. So, just to refresh, in the Canadian parliamentary system, the head of the political party that wins the most seats in the parliament becomes the prime minister. And this is all very officialized, with a party's candidate for prime minister occupying a formal position in their party's hierarchy, known simply as the leader. Party leaders are elected by the approximately 2% of Canadians who are formal, registered, card-carrying, and usually fee-paying members of political parties. Justin Trudeau was elected leader of the Liberal Party back in 2013 in an election decided by about 120,000 registered Liberal Party supporters. And that one vote Trudeau won 12 years ago has been the only internal Liberal Party election he ever had to win. That one vote gave him the mandate to lead his party through 3 separate elections as party boss, including 2 of them as incumbent prime minister seeking another term. Trudeau has never been forced to go through any sort of re-nomination contest because the Liberal Party is a private entity that makes its own rules, and the Liberal Party constitution does not require their party leader to ever face another vote. The Liberal Party constitution also contains no formal mechanism to kick out a leader that they have gotten sick of, which is why his politicians had to resort to shaming him into quitting on his own. The Conservative and NDP parties work in slightly different ways. Indeed, Jagmeet Singh and Pierre Poilievre only are where they are today because their parties chose to vote out a previous leader. But those systems have their problems too, in part because they only give their party members an up or down, the leader is good, or the leader should be fired choice, as opposed to a regularly scheduled election where the leader has to campaign to keep his job and campaign against would-be rivals. This simple yes or no system is a classic example of the old axiom that you can't beat someone with no one, which is probably why most of the time in Canada, incumbent party leaders get a 90% yes vote, even if they have already repeatedly lost multiple elections. It seems to me that a better democratic system would be one that forces the leaders of all of the political parties to face regularly scheduled competitive elections so that their position as party leader was constantly being refreshed with a true democratic mandate. I also think that the number of people who vote in these things should be dramatically increased beyond just the 2% of the Canadian population who are registered party members. Which leads me into the other problem that Trudeau's resignation has highlighted, the spectacle of new midterm prime ministers coming to power when the vast majority of Canadians have never voted for them. The Prime Minister of Canada is an extremely powerful office with a ton of unilateral power. They appoint all sorts of people to important government positions. They can issue all sorts of substantial government policies by independent decree. They can send our troops to war. They can schedule the exact timing of elections. For Canada to be a functional democracy, it is therefore deeply important that the people of Canada control who gets this powerful job. And in fairness, most of the time we do. Prime Minister Trudeau won 3 elections fair and square, as did Prime Minister Harper before him. But Trudeau's decision to resign before Canada's next general election means that the Liberal Party is now going to impose a new Prime Minister on this country who the vast majority of Canadians will have never elected. After the Liberals pick a new party leader, Trudeau will step down as party leader and Prime Minister at the same time, and this new person will assume both jobs in his place. And while it is not clear exactly how many registered Liberals will vote in the Liberal Party's leadership election that will be held sometime in the coming months, it will almost certainly be some minuscule fraction of the overall Canadian population, as it always is. In other words, the next Prime Minister of Canada, the person who will be making the most important decisions facing this country for at least some portion of this year, will have been chosen by a percentage of the Canadian public that will almost certainly number in the low single digits. Now, in the lead up to Trudeau's resignation, there was some talk that he was thinking of setting up some sort of arrangement in which he would step down as head of the Liberal Party, but only step down as Prime Minister after the next Canadian general election, after Canadians had been given a chance to either vote for that new Liberal leader or for Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader. I think that that would have been a more sensible and democratic way to run things, and indeed is the way that things tend to work in other parliamentary democracies. But I guess no self-respecting Canadian political party ever wants to give up the privilege of having their party leader run as the incumbent prime minister in an election, holding all of the dignity and prestige of that office. I mean, in any Canadian election, one of the big questions that voters are always told to consider is whether a candidate seems prime ministerial. And if a candidate has already been prime minister for several months up until that point, well, that seems like an advantage. In my lifetime, Canada has seen 3 prime ministers who got the job because they were installed by a few thousand party supporters. When the most recent one, Paul Martin, was installed in 2003, I remember the press noting that the number of party members who had voted for him was fewer than the number of people who had chosen that year's Canadian Idol. When Trudeau finally does step aside, it is unclear how long the new prime minister installed by his party will be in power for. It could be months, it could just be a few weeks. But especially at a time like this, when Canada is engaged in a lot of tense diplomacy with the White House over tariffs, I think it is both risky and wrong to hand over the reins of power for any length of time to someone who the vast majority of Canadians never assented to giving the power to make decisions in our name. All right, now talking of the ominous unilateral powers of the Canadian Prime Minister, one of them is the power to suspend or prorogue the current sitting of the Canadian Parliament. This power has the effect of killing all legislation currently being debated, ending all parliamentary committees and investigations, and shutting down Q&A time on the floor of the House. Perhaps most importantly of all, it also stops the Parliament from being able to introduce any new bills or resolutions. At the same press conference where he announced his intention to resign, Prime Minister Trudeau also announced that he would be suspending the Parliament for the next 77 days, not allowing it to reconvene until March 24th.
And the House will now be prorogued until March 24th.
This will be the second longest suspension of Parliament in at least 40 years. And why did Trudeau choose to do this? Well, because 77 days is a reasonable assumption of how long it might take for his party to hold a contest to pick a new prime minister, and he doesn't want that process to get disrupted by Parliament voting on stuff like a motion of no confidence. In theory, in the Canadian system, if the Canadian Parliament loses faith in the Prime Minister, they can vote to end his term and force an early election. The Conservative Party spent much of 2024 trying to trigger one of these against Trudeau, but the smaller parties in the Parliament refused to cooperate. The NDP in particular, which had been in an informal coalition with Trudeau for much of his third term, seemed to always have some sort of excuse to not support a no-confidence vote, even as they constantly claimed they wanted to see Trudeau out as much as anyone else. By the time the NDP changed their mind and said, you know what, we do think Trudeau should get non-confidence voted, it was a few days before Christmas, and the Parliament was on a winter recess that wasn't scheduled to end until late January. And of course, the only person with the power to end the winter recess earlier was, you guessed it, the Prime Minister. But of course, Prime Minister Trudeau didn't want the Parliament to come back any sooner, and that's why he gave them an additional 77 days of mandatory vacation. Now, the romantic ideal of the parliamentary system is that the Prime Minister only holds office with the support of Parliament. In some countries, this means that the Prime Minister is elected by a vote of the Parliament. In the Canadian system, he is installed automatically based on the parliamentary seat count, and we are supposed to gauge Parliament's continued support of him based on their willingness to vote him out. At this point, it is pretty undeniable that Trudeau does not have the support of the majority of the members of the Parliament. Indeed, we now know pretty clearly that what the parliamentary majority wants is an emergency general election to let voters pick a new Prime Minister. So, it is hard to say that this principle of Prime Ministers only holding office with parliamentary support is how Canada's government actually works in practice. Indeed, because Prime Minister Trudeau has the power to control when Parliament does or doesn't sit, It's much more accurate to say that Parliament is subordinate to the Prime Minister rather than the other way around. I mean, it was gracious that Trudeau even set a firm March 24th date to reconvene the Parliament at all, since the Constitution says he could have gone much longer. Legally, he only has to convene it once every 12 months. When the Liberal Party eventually gets around to picking a new person to be Prime Minister, they will obviously not have the support of the Parliament either. Parliament will have played no role at all in bringing this new person to power, in fact, suggesting that once again the Prime Ministership is quite divorced from the preferences of the Parliament. Depending on who the Liberal Party chooses, Canada's new Prime Minister might not even have a seat in the Parliament, which in theory isn't supposed to happen, but sometimes does. The only consistent logic behind any of this is just partisan self-interest. Trudeau is making strategic decisions that he thinks will help make his party more popular before the next general election, and that is pretty much the only real logic that can be used to justify his resignation, the appointment of a new prime minister, and the suspension of the parliament. I mean, you could also argue that partisanship is the only reason why the other parties want parliament to reconvene, so that they can vote no confidence in Trudeau and force an early election. But that is at least closer to the sort of logic that the system is supposed to honor. Protecting an embattled political party from an electoral wipeout, by contrast, isn't what the Canadian democratic system is supposed to exist to do, but too often that's exactly what it is used to do. We have been mostly talking about procedural stuff relating to the Canadian system of government today, which I think is appropriate because we're in a moment right now where procedure is basically the only thing defining Canadian politics. The Canadian newspapers have certainly been full of articles and explainers lately, trying to spell out some of these procedural complexities. You know, how does proroguing the parliament work? How will the Liberals pick their new leader? How will the eventual no confidence vote play out? And so on. And this is all important stuff that is worth understanding. But it's also worth remembering that Canada is not just a political reality show. It is a real country full of real people facing a lot of very real problems right now, particularly an economy on the brink of recession and an unusually tense period of US-Canada relations. And in that context, I think it is important that we understand that this current political soap opera exposing the weirdness of the Canadian political system is a sideshow that Prime Minister Trudeau has chosen to force this country to endure. Many will find the drama of the Liberals installing a new Prime Minister and their looming conflict with the Parliament to be fascinating and entertaining in the way that unusual political developments often are. But it's also a huge distraction that will bring the proper functioning of the Canadian government to a virtual standstill for several months at a really critical time for this country, and all in the service of a last-ditch effort to save a political party with one foot in the grave. Someday, I will make a full-length video about the legacy of Prime Minister Trudeau's 10 years in power, the good and the bad. But the preposterously cynical, drawn-out way that he has chosen to end his prime ministership, I really do think has added an enormous dark stain to a reputation that wasn't looking all that clean to begin with.